G'day, I'm Gary, and this is my custom poured concrete block raised bed. It can be used in a number of ways. You could fill it with soil and use it as is, or you could do what Robbie did, set up a modular system using these 4 totes. It's a comfortable height to sit on. You can reach across to the other side, so it's easy to maintain your plants. It would have cost more than double had I used lumber, and it could last hundreds of years. The Alvord Lake Bridge in San Francisco was built in 1889 and it's still being used today. I've built a number of raised beds, some wooden, some out of concrete blocks. Here in Southern California, any untreated lumber in contact with the ground will either rot or be destroyed by termites in a very short period of time. A few years ago I built my raised beds out of concrete blocks. I spent a lot of time getting them level and square. Now only after a couple of years they're no longer level or square. With this design I'm hoping to overcome some of the problems I've had with the other 2 methods. The wall is very stable. Each block is locked together and linked together, so it's tough to separate them. The way I separate it, I have a keystone at the end here. Once you remove the keystone, it's just a matter of popping out the other blocks. They're all interlocked and easy to remove. Each block weighs less than 15 pounds. I've got other details that I'll discuss in the video that helps hold it together. But to put it back in place, it's just a matter of locking the blocks back in and replacing the keystone. It's an interlocking puzzle. Once it's together, it doesn't really want to come apart. If I want to move it, all I have to do is disassemble it and move it wherever I want it. So this could be handed down to other gardeners in the future, and this is going to last multiple lifetimes. In this video I'll show you how I built this using grocery store bags and some simple formwork that I made. The first thing I did was build a platform out of old pallets. I attached some scrap lumber to the bottom of them. Because the driveway is on a slope, I needed to level it out. Once it was level, I added a scrap piece of plywood on top. Now I had a secure base that was going to support the weight of the concrete. The platform measures 8 foot long by 4 foot wide. That gives me enough space to sit 4 18-gallon totes inside the planter. I laid the totes out so I could get the dimensions for the formwork. I built the inner formwork, leaving enough space so I could lift the totes in and out. I also left an extra space on either end of the formwork. Most totes are similar in size, but that will provide room if other brands are used in the future. I made the height of the formwork so that the finished blocks will sit level with the top of the totes. It's also a comfortable height for sitting on, so it can be used as a stable seat when you're taking care of the plants. I made the panels for the formwork out of salvaged 2x4s and plywood. I decided to make the width of the blocks 6 inches wide. The formwork is easy to put together. I'm using deck screws to hold the panels in place. Because I'm pouring in layers, it doesn't need any extra bracing. Now that I have that together, I can make as many raised beds as I want. With the panels in place, I double checked to make sure that everything was still centered. Before I started, I did a test run using a bag full of sand. I wanted to make sure it was going to sit right and none of my formwork was going to shift. I wanted nice round corners, so I took some scrap vinyl, I cut it into strips, I used some duct tape to hold it in position. The vinyl is stiff enough to hold its shape. Any sharp corners or anywhere I thought the bag might tear, I also covered in vinyl and duct tape. Because I'm going to stack the concrete blocks, I decided to add some reinforcement. I'm going to use some 1/2 inch Schedule 40 PVC pipes. I've got 2 of those. I've also got 4 elbows that I'll use to join them together. It doesn't have to be perfect, so I'm just going to eyeball it. So I'm going to get the PVC pipe, line it up roughly in the center of the concrete and simply mark a center point on both of them. Because I do a lot of PVC work, I have PVC pipe cutters. If you were going to buy a tool for this job, I would suggest getting a hacksaw, because a hacksaw can be used in other projects. So you could use a hacksaw. It's just a matter of cutting them. So now I've got the long ends cut. I don't need to glue them in, I'm just going to dry fit the elbows. And I'm going to do the same thing with the pieces that I have left over. I'll set these roughly in the center. So I'll put those two together. I'll mark them out. So that's roughly center. And I'm going to have very little scrap left over. So the scrap left over I can use for other projects. These just pop together really easy. Now I've got a frame that I can just mount on top of the concrete blocks once I pour them. So that'll set something like that. You'll get a better idea as I go along of what I'm doing with that. So now I've got that ready to go. I think I'm pretty much set. So now is the fun part, and that's pouring the concrete. To make it easier to add the wet concrete on a flat surface, I rolled the sides of the bags down. There are folds on the bottom of the bags. Initially I covered them with masking tape to prevent the concrete from going underneath. If you're mindful on how you fill the bags, you don't really need to do that. If you turn the bag inside out, you'll have a straight fold and you only need one piece of masking tape. To calculate how many bags I needed, I added 15 pounds of sand to this bag. I'm using 60-pound bags of concrete mix, so out of every bag I'll get roughly 4 blocks. I wanted 3 rows of blocks. My formwork is 15 inches high, so each row will be about 5 inches high. So to check that, I dropped the bag to the bottom, measured it, so that measures about 5 inches, and that's enough concrete per bag for one row. The sand and the wet concrete will have the same consistency. Once the concrete cures, it will have the same weight as the bag of sand. I'm going to use my cement mixer to mix the concrete. I have electricity nearby. That's another good reason why I'm doing it off-site. If you don't have a cement mixer, a wheelbarrow would work out just as well. It's just going to take a lot longer. I set up a little staging area along here. So I built a little shed to store the premixed concrete. I've got a trash can to throw the empty bags. I've got my mixer, my wheelbarrow, and I've got the formwork down there. The first batch of concrete that I mixed, I added a lot more water than I normally would. With a wetter mix, I was able to see how it sat in the formwork, and from there I knew how thick to make it. When I saw it was too thin, I made the next batches thicker. I added 3 shovelfuls of concrete to each bag and set them in the center. When I finished each batch, I added the bags to the formwork. The corner blocks are the most important blocks as they help hold the walls in place, so I started there first. Then I packed the other bags up against them. When all the bags were in place, I added the locking features. Retaining wall blocks have a lip on the back that holds them in place. I wanted to recreate that, so I added some 2x2s along the inside formwork. I embedded them into the concrete. I wanted to create a channel or a void so that when I poured the next row of blocks, a lip would form on the back of them. Then I added the PVC frame. I made sure it was centered. I tapped it down using a mallet so it would embed in the surface of the concrete. That created a void for it to rest in. After 3 days, I removed the PVC frame and the blocks that I used to create the keyways. I opened up the bag of concrete. It was dark grey and still brittle. I could scratch it with my nail, so I covered it back over. I left the formwork around the first course for a couple of weeks. It was very simple to remove it. I connected it together using 2 screws at each corner, and I also had 8 screws total connecting it to the pallet base. I only removed the outer panels. At this point they were held up by duct tape, and this allowed me access to the bags filled with concrete. I've used grocery store bags as moulds for a couple of my concrete projects, so when I started to peel the bag away, I realised right away that I'd left it too long. Normally a bag will pull away cleanly. I had to tear the bag off. This time around, a lot of the bag got embedded in the concrete. When I poured the next 2 courses, I knew I had to remove the bags earlier. As I removed the bags, I linked them back together up against the inside formwork. I'm happy with the way my first course of blocks turned out. I'm going to make a couple of changes before I pour the second course. The 2x2s that I used to create a keyway on the back of the blocks, it could have been a little smoother. The 1/2 inch PVC on top could have gone down a little better. Because the bag's bunched up at the top, it didn't sit perfectly level. So there's a few spots where it's lifted up a bit more. The next row will sit over it, so that will help lock that in place. It won't really matter if it's in the first course of blocks or the second. It should help to hold it together. When I pour the next row of blocks, a lip will form in this keyway. That would have been enough to hold everything together. Adding the PVC pipe will not only help support the wall, I'm going to use it as a guide to realign the blocks when I reassemble them later. I reassembled the formwork and started the second course. Each block is unique, but I wanted to lay them down as if I was building a brick wall. I wanted each bag to sit above the gap between the 2 blocks below it. Again, I started on the corners first. Each bag of concrete followed and filled in the profile below it. I worked on one batch at a time, and when the bags were all laid out, I added the 2x2 blocks that would create the keyway that would form the lips on the final course. This time around, I tapped them in position and I packed the bags down using a 2x4. Then, so they wouldn't shift, I screwed them in place. I added the screws ahead of time at an angle so that it would be easier to remove them later on. When everything was in place, I went around, I tugged at the bags to remove some of the folds, and I also rounded off the tops. Then I opened up the bags, packed them down a little bit more. I left them open at the top to make sure that the bags wouldn't bunch on the wet concrete. I let the concrete set for 3 days before I removed the keyway blocks and I put them to one side. Then I removed the panels. Up until now, it was just a design in my mind. Once I removed the panels, I got to see it for the first time in real life. The faces were flat, the blocks were flush with each other, and I had that random stacked stone look that I was after. Staggering the blocks like this will help to stabilise the wall. The bottom of the top blocks will form the same profile as the top of the blocks below them and lock them in place. I'll let the bags sit for another 3 days, which made the job easier to remove the bags, but I still had an issue with the plastic embedding in the concrete. When all the bags were removed, I restacked and locked in place all of the blocks so I could replace the formwork and pour the final row. After pouring the last course of blocks, I allowed it to dry for a few days. On top of the blocks, I wanted a nice finished surface, so every day I would come out, open up the bag and smooth out the surface. Because the concrete wasn't completely hardened, I was able to smooth them out simply with my hands. I then removed the panels to look things over. Each layer that I poured was better than the last. By the time I got to the top layer, I had things down pat. I had the concrete consistency right. It had packed down well and filled all the voids, and there were very few spaces between the blocks in the top layer and the blocks in the middle layer. Then I removed the outer formwork, laid it around the base, so I had a flat surface to stack the bagged blocks. To separate the blocks, I worked from the corners. I went around and I found the loosest one. This one wants to stay. This one grips a little more. This one here is pretty loose. This one doesn't really want to move. This is the best one, so I think I'll start with this one. I'll gently jiggle it backwards and forwards until it comes free. I'll set that to one side and start working my way around. As I work my way along, I stack them in order on the formwork panels. At this stage, I have to be careful handling the blocks. The concrete is still soft and very brittle, and it doesn't take much to damage or chip them. As I peel away the plastic bag, I notice that there are pieces that have fallen off. The most important surface is the top face and the two front faces that are going to be exposed. When it's still soft like this, it's easier to peel the plastic away from the concrete. This is a corner piece. And on the inside here, I'm already starting to break some of the thinner pieces. You won't be able to see it once the blocks are assembled and put back together. So this one sits on the corner like this. I'll clean it up a little bit more before I lay them out for the final time. But now that I've got it exposed, it's just a matter of rubbing the corners, and it's still easy enough just by hand to just smooth it all out. I can smooth the top out a little more, and I'll get a nice polished finish. At this point, the concrete is cured enough. It won't be too harsh on my hands. You could always wear gloves or use a slightly damp sponge. I just have to smooth off the edges and move on to the next one. This was one of those jobs that you learn as you go. On the first row, I should have removed them from the bag sooner. On the second row, I should have packed them down a little more. I can see there's a lot of gaps. And with the top row, I should have left them in the bags longer, as some of them are going to be chipped. And this one just clicks in, and I can just smooth it off. It's a lot easier to work with at 3 or 4 days old than it is a couple of weeks. Once it hardens up to this stage, you will need to use sandpaper. There's less plastic embedded in the top blocks. Over time, the plastic in the lower two blocks will degrade. Eventually, it won't be visible anymore. It's just a matter of working my way around until I remove all the plastic from the blocks. Underneath, the masking tape is held nicely to the plastic bag, and none of the concrete went under the folds. That's looking good. Over the next few days, I'll just sprinkle this with a little bit of water from the hose just to keep it damp. I may even cover it up a little bit just to protect it from the sun. But this is my top layer. and I'll just continue on. I'll finish this up. I needed to set it up on a flat surface. This area here in Robbie's front garden is on a slope, so in order to set it flat I had to build this footing. I poured a little different than the previous pourings I'd done. I've actually double poured it, so I poured 2 bags at the same time. So I poured one row and then the next on top of it. Down this end there's only 1 block, so on the high side it has 1 block and on the opposite side it has 2. Because it's on a slope and because it's on blacktop, I decided to pour a little bit of concrete to get it started. Concrete will stick to blacktop really well. I wanted to make sure nothing was going to slide over time, so by pouring a little bit of concrete down first before I started pouring the blocks, that will give it a better grip to the blacktop. The day after I poured the blocks, I took a pair of scissors, I trimmed the handles and the excess plastic off the top. Then I waited a couple of days until it hardened up a little more. What I wanted to do was rough it up a little bit so that I had a flat surface but it wasn't slick. So now I've got a nice flat footing to set the blocks up on. The inside I think I'll fill with soil so that the totes will be able to just sit straight on soil and the totes will be level. It's been 6 days now, so what I'm going to do today is remove the rest of the plastic. So I'll lift the blocks out and one by one I'll remove the plastic bags and then I'll restack them. Because they're interlocking, they're very easy to move in and out. I can just move them out, remove the plastic bag, and that comes off pretty easily. I may have a little bit of plastic left in. It's going to chip a little bit, but that's okay. What I've got underneath is a similar thing that I did when I did my first blocks. I put the PVC pipe in, and the PVC pipe formed a channel or a groove in the concrete, and that allows it to just stack and lock in position. So what I'll do now is just go through, remove the blocks one by one, take the plastic off, then I'll restack them. So once the blocks are back in place, this will be very stable and I'll be able to get this set up. Once the concrete had cured and it hardened up enough, I decided to move it onto the footing. To make it easier to put everything back together, I decided to mark it with a marker. So this direction here behind me is north. So on the top row I wrote top 1 north, the middle row M1 north, the bottom row B1 north. So I just decided to go around on the northern side first. So the next one would be top 2 north, middle 2 north, and bottom 2 north. So I worked my way around, and once I'd done that, I decided to lay them out in layers. With every row there seems to be a keystone. Now what I mean by a keystone is some of the corners won't pull away easily, and neither will the middle ones. But this corner here, I can just lift straight out, and this one locks all the others in place. So I just decided to lay them out in the order that they came in. So I can start with the top, I'll work my way down, laid them out here. Then I was able to move the bottom row and set that up on top of the footing. I moved the concrete blocks into Robbie's garden. I put the bottom row directly on the footing. I measured from corner to corner both ways to make sure that it was sitting square. Once it was sitting square, I set the PVC frame on top. I fitted it into the grooves in the blocks. Then I used a straight edge to make sure everything was straight. I used a mallet to tap them into position. I also found that my boot was also useful to get things lined up. Once I got the bottom layer in position, the other two layers just fell into place. I started with a corner block, sat it on top, and that locked into the PVC frame. Then I just went around and I added the blocks one by one. I set the blocks out here so that it was easy to get to. So it's just a matter of walking them across and locking them in. The last one to put in position is the keystone. I finished this at the end of 2020. It didn't take me that long to build it. It took me a lot longer to put the video together. The outside measurement measures 7 foot long by 40 inches wide. The inside measurement is 6 foot long by 27 inches wide. It's scalable. I can make it larger or smaller. I could change the shape if I wanted to. To make it longer, I would just have to disassemble it and add extra blocks, and that wouldn't change the overall look of it. I can work at my own pace. I could make one block at a time. I could do a row like I did this time round, or if I really wanted to, I could pour the whole lot at once. I like the idea that I could build it off-site and move it here. If you had bad weather or you didn't have time to do this during the day, you could build it somewhere under cover and move it out and assemble it during the day. For this one, I used 18 bags of premixed 60-pound concrete. There are a couple of ways to do this even cheaper. If you're able to manage 80 or 90-pound bags of concrete, then the cost of the concrete per pound drops a little. Some places sell damaged bags at a discounted price. It doesn't hurt to ask. Contractors usually don't like getting the broken bags because it slows them down. If you're doing a project like this and mixing in small batches, it's not that much extra work. In a dry climate with low humidity, I've been able to store bags of concrete for a couple of years, so you can collect what you need over time. A number of subscribers have been asking about this raised bed for a while, so I thought I'd better get this video done. They've seen it in Robbie's garden tours and some of her other videos, and that brings me to this point. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it around. By subscribing to our channel, you'll have an easy way to find us again. If you look through some of our videos, I'm sure you'll find something useful and interesting there. We have a lot of ideas and ongoing projects, so if you tap the bell, YouTube will notify you when we publish a new video. All this helps our channel. So this is a really sustainable project. Like I said earlier, the concrete will last an incredible long time. I'm using these grocery store bags. These ones are reusable, but you can really use any grocery store bags, providing they don't have holes in them. So this isn't going to the landfill right away. With that, thanks for watching, and don't forget to eat what you grow. I'll catch you later.